Welcome back to the Gold Creek Extended Cut podcast, where we dive a little bit deeper into the weekend message. My name is Nick, and I'm the pastor at Gold Creek. This week, I'm solo, just me by myself with my thoughts on this podcast. So it's obviously going to be a little bit different. If you join us for a few other of these, we always have a guest on. We'll have them in the future. But this week, just me, I wanted to jump in here and dig in a little bit deeper to a couple of things that we talked about over the weekend. We're in the series called Full Force Faith. If you're part of our church, we did something really special last Sunday. We received a special offering for Convoy of Hope and got to see and hear their impact together. You know, it's one of those, I'll say a little more unfiltered here on the podcast. It's always tough because as a pastor, as a Christian, as a human, like I want to support everybody. You know, this is one of those things where I wish we could come alongside everyone with need and eliminate all those needs. But as we know, even as Jesus says himself in the Gospels, the poor you will have with you always. And so there's always going to be people with need, but we got to make a big dent as a church. I don't know what the total's going to be, but when the dust settles, we got the fund open, but I think we're a little over $70,000 right now, which is 583 kids getting 3 meals a day for a year, I heard. So I was doing the rough math, and that's about 680,000 meals that we're able to provide. So blown away by that, just the generosity of people. Anyway, I could talk about that all day, but this week we jumped back into the series that we kicked off for August called Full Force Faith. And it's really a question about, like, what does it mean to be activated and aligned in our faith in Jesus Christ? And we're using for the series this letter, First and Second Thessalonians, for the series as a little bit of a lens on a group of people who were fully alive in their faith. And we talked about this the first week of the podcast a little bit, the first week of the message. I'm going to camp out a little bit in First Thessalonians because I think it is it's like the Apostle Paul founds the church, and then he sends, probably a year or two later, he sends Timothy, who's like his young apprentice. He goes, hey, go check on the church, go see how they're doing. And then Timothy comes back and reports to Paul and says that largely it's going well, which is interesting because in some of the other Pauline letters, they go check on, Paul gets reports back from the churches and it's not going well. It's a bunch of weird things happening. It can still happen in church, but he gets a good report back and it's interesting because the letters of First and Second Thessalonians are Paul's earliest letters, and so they're a little bit of like the proofing of how the gospel can transform a group of people in this new Roman Empire. It's interesting if you look at where and how Christianity is spreading in the Roman world. A lot of times you could point to, if you just from a sociological perspective, some people would say, like, well, the only reason that Christianity spread so quickly is because of it was attached to the Roman Empire. And I would agree with that sentiment. Yes, that is true. Where I would disagree maybe is like the why. Either it was a complete accident or God was using, in his providence, this network of distribution that the Roman roads and the infrastructure they had built around Central Europe, North Africa, extending into modern day Western Europe, like, that was intentional. God was able to use those things for the gospel to spread in the way that it did. And so it's interesting, the gospel spreading, but the church in Thessalonica is the very first expression of this. So we can almost like study this group of people as like, why did Christianity spread? What was unique about it? And this week on Sunday, we talked about the idea of purpose. Like, you see this in the community, these people become activated in their purpose. And it's interesting because I think this is a unique thing about Christianity, even if you were to look at like the major world religions, you could, and I'm not an expert in comparative religion, but I think you could say that Islam, the core teaching would be like submit to the one true God, Allah. Buddhism, in its many, many expressions throughout Asia. But, from what I can understand about Buddhism, it's a little bit of, and Buddhism is the oldest of the major world religions, but it kind of is a form of humanism. It's kind of the idea of achieve enlightenment by following the path and principles in the right way. And that will allow you to disconnect from, it's almost like detach from the world completely so that you can achieve enlightenment. Islam would say submit to God as Allah, and then you can find peace in that submission. But then it's interesting because Christianity teaches that through God's Son, Jesus Christ, you can endure suffering. So you don't separate yourself from it, and you don't have to cower in fear to God. We have a reverence for God, but through Jesus, you can know God personally. And what's interesting is, as we talked about in the message, and I think even the more I study this, the more it creates like a little bit of a feedback loop of if this is true about God and you embrace this is what happened, God created the world, but that sent his son for that world, it does begin this major activation of purpose in our life. One of the things that we shared in the message is that sometimes as Christians, if you're listening and you're a Christian, sometimes it's easy to think that, well, everybody else doesn't have to think about this or something. And I think that could be true for, other areas for Christians, right? Like Christians would maybe think, oh, well, I would have, if I wasn't following God's plan financially, I would have more money, or I would have more fun and more freedom in my sexuality if I didn't. It's almost like constraining. And I think for Christians, sometimes they think about that for purpose. Like, oh man, how come I have to live for something else? Couldn't I just live for myself? But I think what's interesting about that, because I think the implication, what we're saying behind that is like everybody else is happier, they're living for them, they're doing them, and so they're satisfied and happy. And here I am trying to serve God, and sometimes I'm not quite as fulfilled, or it's challenging to have this alternative purpose. But if the last several years of sociology of studying, especially young people, have taught us anything, it's that by and large, most people are not thriving. We think we don't need to hammer on this. I think we've all heard at this point the astronomical statistics of anxiety and depression, especially in young people. And I think part of that is that question of purpose. Like it is, I am empathetic toward people now who are maybe in high school or college or out of college who are trying to say, like, they're trying to find purpose in the world, and kind of feels like everything's working against them. Everything's more expensive. There's, AI's coming for all of us. And, it's just like this can be this difficult time to like identify purpose in our life. And yet, it's interesting because as a Christian, if you're a Christian, purpose is something that almost finds you. It arrives at your doorstep. Like if this is true, it's like for people investigating claims about Christianity or beginning to study the Bible and investigate Jesus, what that always leads to in our lives is an element of self-reflection. And then Jesus ends up studying us, and then we end up on this kind of introspective journey, and we go, man, I'm not that fulfilled. Maybe I'm not that happy. And these things that I thought were going to bring purpose into my life didn't bring purpose. Things like career, we've talked about this a lot, like career and hobbies, and even good things like family. It's like, how come this isn't like driving my life forward like I would think? And then when you come to really study Christianity from a lens of relationship, not from religious practice, it's like, well, if God has a purpose for me and I can achieve this freedom through his son Jesus, then purpose, even just waking up every day and participating in the world as a Jesus person, that becomes a pretty foundational element of our purpose. It's a pretty compelling, different way to live our lives. Like it's not just, this accidental thing. So I think this church in Thessalonica, to dig into it a little bit, it's like, I don't know what the first century Roman world was like. I don't know if people were purpose starved in the same ways that they are today, but my guess is they were to a degree. There were people probably saying, hey, I don't seem to have, I'm like making these, Roman things, and I served in the Roman army, and I'm just hoping to get a villa in the south of France and all the whatever. And yet, here's the Christians who come along, and the different components we studied in the sermon talk about how these people have this activated purpose in their life. So clearly there's something about this group of Christians, this group of Jesus people in Thessalonica that has this compelling faith. They have this differentiated purpose in their life. One of the ways that the Apostle Paul describes it is almost like their faith creates like a father relationship with them, almost that parenting relationship. And I think that's like just an interesting parallel that the scripture draws, that like you can feel the same level of purpose you can as a parent, if not more, spiritually. And so I think that I still think today, candidly, I mean, I think that the people I know that have the most dynamic sense of purpose in their life aren't, just entrepreneurs, and they're not just people who lead businesses. Sure, there are people who I'm friends with and know that really aren't Jesus people that have purpose. So I wouldn't say that it's only possible to have a dynamic sense of purpose as a Christian. However, I would say that the kind of purpose you have as a Christian, it resonates on a deeper level. And if I was going to play the averages, more Christians live with a sense of purpose per capita in a pretty disproportionate way. And so I know those are kind of clinical ways to think about it. But in the sermon that as we're walking through this series and navigating purpose and interpreting our lives and our spiritual lives through this lens of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, it's interesting that purpose enters the picture right away. So that's a little bit of a deep dive into it, a little bit of texture from the Bible on how we're navigating purpose in our life. Thanks for joining us on Gold Creek Extended Cut. See you next week.